Somewhere in Florida, there is a road that most people have never heard of. It doesn't appear in tourist brochures. It isn't a shortcut anyone uses on purpose. It runs through a stretch of Golden Gate Estates, a neighborhood that sounds polished, sounds planned, sounds like somewhere people choose to live, but in reality, it is the kind of place where the grass grows too tall in the summer, where the silence between houses is not peaceful, it's just empty. Where the earth is dark and soft and forgiving in ways that don't always feel like a gift. Richards Road sits east of County Road 951, off Immokalee Road, in Naples, Florida. If you've never been, picture this, long flat stretches of scrubland interrupted by the occasional driveway disappearing into the tree line. Mailboxes that stand alone at the edge of dirt paths. The kind of terrain that doesn't announce itself. That doesn't need to. It just waits. April in Florida is the last comfortable month before the heat becomes suffocating. The kind of morning where the air is still slightly cool before 10, where birds are loud and the light is sharp and golden and everything looks, from a distance, like it's doing fine. It was that kind of morning. The deputy was on duty. He pulled to the side of the road, not for any particular reason tied to the case, not because anything looked wrong, not because something had caught his eye. He stepped out of his vehicle to get better cell reception. That was all. That was the entire reason he was standing in that open field on April 14, 2004. A phone call. A few extra bars of signal. The completely ordinary frustration of modern life pulling him 6 steps off the asphalt and into the grass. He didn't know yet what those 6 steps were about to mean. The earth near his feet was disturbed. Not dramatically. Not in the way that makes your heart stop. In the way that makes you pause, look down, tilt your head slightly, and think, that's strange. Just a small area where the ground looked different from the ground around it. Slightly displaced. Slightly settled in a way that didn't match the rest of the field. He looked closer. And when he looked closer, everything changed. Before we get into the next twist in this investigation, I'm curious, what device are you using right now? Phone under the covers. Tablet on the couch. Desktop with headphones on so nobody knows what you're listening to. Drop your location and your setup in the comments, I read them. And if you're here for gripping, detailed true crime stories, make sure you like this video and subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Because what he found beneath that disturbed patch of earth in Golden Gate Estates, beneath the quiet, beneath the ordinary April morning, beneath the grass and the dark Florida soil, was a shallow grave. And inside it, wrapped in a green shower curtain, were the partial skeletal remains of a woman. No name. No ID. No one waiting at the edge of the field to say who she was. Just the remains of a human life, a life that had somehow ended here, in this field, on this road that most people have never heard of. She was dressed. That detail matters more than it might seem at first. She was wearing a sweatshirt. Gray, loose, the kind of thing you wear on a Sunday morning when you don't have anywhere to be. The inside label of that sweatshirt bore the brand name, Favorites. She was wearing sweatpants. And on her feet, the detail that investigators and amateur researchers would return to again and again in the years that followed, she was wearing sneakers. Silver and light blue. Size 7.5. On the heel of each shoe, in small letters, the word Olympics. Beside it, the Olympic Rings logo. Beside that, USA. Someone had bought her those shoes. Someone had seen her alive in them. That is the detail that never lets go. Not the grave, not the curtain, not the missing bones, it's the shoes. Because shoes are chosen. Shoes are specific. Shoes mean something about who a person is, what they were doing, where they were going. And somewhere between whoever bought those shoes and the field on Richards Road, a woman disappeared so completely that 20 years later, no one has been able to say her name. Her age was estimated at somewhere between 30 and 45. Her remains were partial. The right tibia and fibula, the bones of the lower leg, were missing. Some of the bones of her hands and feet were gone as well. The medical examiner could not determine a cause of death. The decomposition, accelerated by the Florida climate, the humidity, the heat that makes the earth work fast, had taken too much. What remained was a skeleton in a shallow grave. What remained was a green shower curtain and a pair of sneakers and a sweatshirt from a brand most people had never heard of. What remained was a question with no answer. The Collier County Sheriff's Office began their investigation. Crime scene technicians processed the site. Photographs were taken. The earth was sifted. The bones were carefully collected. The green shower curtain was bagged. The shoes were documented, every detail, every label. Missing persons databases were checked. Dental records, because she had several dental restorations, clear evidence of a life that included dentists, routines, care, were compared against open files. Nothing matched. The FBI's VICAP database received the case. NamUs, the National Missing and Unidentified Persons System, received the case. 46 women would eventually be ruled out as the decedent. 46 families would feel that specific, horrible mixture of relief and guilt that comes with a negative identification. 46 times, investigators sat across from someone and said, "No, it's not her." And 46 times, there was still a woman in that grave with no name. Now think about what that means. 46 women. 46 separate searches. 46 sets of dental records pulled, compared, and ultimately set aside. And still, nothing. Still, she waits. Still, the file sits open. Still, the case is listed as unresolved in every database that holds it. She was someone's daughter. She may have been someone's mother. She may have been someone's sister, someone's neighbor, the woman at the end of the street who always waved from her porch, the woman whose absence someone noticed and didn't quite know how to explain. Or she may have been the woman whose absence no one reported, the person who existed in the spaces between official systems, who moved through the world without leaving the kind of paper trail that makes you findable when you are gone. And that possibility, that she may have been someone who disappeared without anyone calling it in, is perhaps the heaviest part of this entire story. Because here is the thing about disappearing in America in 2004. You could do it. You could slip between the cracks. You could be a person whose life was complicated enough, whose connections were fragile enough, whose circumstances were uncertain enough, that your absence was explained away before it was ever investigated. She left. She moved on. She always did this kind of thing. She'll turn up. You know how she is. Those sentences. Those quiet, devastating sentences that people say to each other in the weeks after someone goes missing, before they realize they aren't coming back. Before the explanation stops feeling sufficient. Before the not knowing becomes impossible to live with. Did someone say those sentences about her? Did someone sit with the discomfort of her absence and choose, for reasons that made sense at the time, to believe she was fine? We don't know. That's the honest answer. We don't know if anyone noticed. We don't know if anyone called. We don't know if her disappearance was absorbed into someone's silence the way sound is absorbed into thick walls, present, real, vibrating, but never quite making it out the other side. What we know is this: a woman died. She was placed in a green shower curtain. She was carried to a field in Golden Gate Estates. She was buried in a shallow grave off Richards Road in Naples, Florida. And for 20 years, no one has been able to tell us who she was. That is where this story begins. Not at the end. Not at the discovery. Not at the crime scene photograph or the forensic report or the NamUs entry that lists her as a case number, an estimated age range, a clothing description. It begins somewhere before all of that. Somewhere in an ordinary life. In a morning routine, a cup of coffee going cold on a counter, a pair of shoes pulled on without much thought because they were comfortable and because wherever she was going, she planned to come back. She planned to come back. That is the part that stays with you, if you let it. The ordinariness of it. The fact that nothing about those shoes, silver and light blue, size 7.5, Olympics and USA stamped into the heel, suggests a woman who thought she was living her last day. Nothing about a gray sweatshirt and sweatpants suggests someone who was afraid. These are the clothes of comfort. The clothes of a Tuesday morning, a weekend errand, an afternoon walk. The clothes of someone who was going somewhere familiar, doing something routine, expecting to return to whatever passed for normal in her life. And somewhere between that expectation and Richards Road, something happened that we have not yet been able to reconstruct. The field where she was found is not a dramatic place. It does not look like a crime scene. It looks like Florida looks in hundreds of thousands of acres across the state, scrubland, grass, the occasional tree twisted by years of wind and heat. Golden Gate Estates is a community that was developed decades ago with a grid of roads laid out across miles of what was once Everglades wetland. The development was ambitious in scale and patchy in execution. Some of those roads lead to neighborhoods. Some of them lead nowhere in particular. Some of them run through open fields and dead ends and stretches of land where the only company is the silence. Richards Road was that kind of place. The kind of place where a deputy might pull over to use his phone. Where no one would particularly notice a car parked at the edge of the grass. Where someone could stop, carry something heavy, make a decision they had probably been planning for a while, and drive away without being seen. Without being seen. That phrase is doing a lot of work in this story. We will return to it. We will turn it over and look at it from different angles, the way you look at an object you don't quite understand, trying to find the side of it that makes sense. Because someone was not seen here. Someone came to this field, this quiet, obscure field on a road most people have never heard of, and did something that required privacy and time and a familiarity with the terrain that suggests this wasn't the first time they'd been here. Or it was the first time. And they'd simply studied the map. Counted on the isolation. Trusted that in a place this quiet, a shallow grave would not be found for a long time. They were right about that, probably. Except for a deputy and a phone call with bad reception. Except for the ordinary frustration that pulled him 6 steps off the asphalt. 6 steps. That is the margin between this story being told and it never being told at all. There are things about Golden Gate Estates that the real estate listings don't mention. They will tell you about the lot sizes, large, generous, private. They will mention the proximity to Naples, to the beaches, to the shopping along 5th Avenue South where the storefronts are lit like something out of a catalog. They will tell you about the weather, always the weather in Florida, as though sunshine is a sufficient answer to every other question. What they don't mention is the quiet. Not the peaceful kind. The other kind, the kind that exists in places where the houses are spaced far enough apart that a sound made between them simply dissolves before it reaches anyone. The kind of quiet where a car slowing down on a dirt road at 2 in the morning means nothing to nobody because there's Northwest 1 close enough to hear it stop. In 2004, Golden Gate Estates was still a place in transition. Naples was growing, rapidly, in the aggressive, sun-soaked way that Florida developments tend to grow, concrete and asphalt spreading out from the coast like something trying to cover its tracks. The affluent neighborhoods near the water were one thing. The sprawl further inland was another. Out past CR 951, past the gas stations and the strip malls and the last familiar landmark, the roads got quieter and the trees got thicker and the people got further apart. This is context. Not just for the investigation. For understanding how something like this happens in the first place. She was not found in a visible place. She was not found at the edge of a busy road, or in a park, or somewhere that people walk through regularly. She was found in a field that a deputy stepped into by accident, chasing cell signal. The location itself is a statement. Whoever brought her there knew what they were doing, or knew enough. They knew that isolation was available within 45 minutes of downtown Naples if you drove in the right direction and turned down the right road. And this raises the first question that pulls at everything else: did they know this area? The possibility that her killer lived nearby, or had lived nearby, or had been to this specific stretch of land before, is something investigators would have considered early. It is a behavioral reality of crime that people dispose of evidence in places they know. Not always. There are exceptions. But as a general pattern, the choice of location tends to tell us something about the person who made it. Rural Florida is vast. The fact that this particular field, on this particular road, was selected, that decision did not happen randomly. But here is where the question becomes complicated. Because Golden Gate Estates in 2004 was a place of high turnover. Seasonal residents who came for the winters and disappeared in the summer. Migrant workers who moved through the agricultural areas nearby, some documented, some not, all of them existing in a world that didn't keep careful track of them. Construction crews who worked the building projects that were reshaping the area and then moved on to the next job. A transient, fluid population moving through a place that was itself in the process of becoming something else. Anyone could have been here. Anyone could have known the roads. Anyone could have turned down Richards Road on a winter night or an early spring morning and decided that this was far enough. The investigation hit these walls early. No witnesses had come forward. No vehicle had been identified near the scene. No one in the surrounding community reported having seen anything unusual in the days or weeks around the burial, but this was a community where unusual things could happen without drawing much notice, where the distances between neighbors meant that the bar for something worth mentioning was set higher than it might be elsewhere. What investigators had was what the earth had given them, and not much more. A green shower curtain. This detail is easy to pass over, easy to treat as a practical observation about the method of transport. But sit with it for a moment. A green shower curtain is a household object. It comes from a bathroom. It is an object so ordinary, so embedded in daily domestic life, that most people would not be able to describe the one hanging in their own home without going to look. It's just there. It hangs in the background of every morning routine. It's the thing behind the thing. And yet someone removed one, from a hook, from a rod, from a space that was probably familiar and private and connected to a life, and used it to wrap a woman's body for transport. Think about that. The practical calculation involved. The decision to use something that was at hand, that was large enough, that would serve the purpose, that was, in the logic of the moment, sufficient. It suggests a certain kind of deliberateness. Not panicked, not improvised from nothing, but working with what was available. Working from a place where a shower curtain was within reach. A home. An apartment. A trailer. A rented room. Wherever she was before she was here, she was somewhere that had a bathroom with a shower curtain. And someone removed it. The shoes with the Olympic branding on the heel would become one of the most significant identifying details of the case, not because they were exotic or rare, but because they were specific enough to potentially be remembered. Olympic merchandise had broad distribution in the United States in the years surrounding major games. The 2000 Summer Olympics in Sydney and the 2002 Winter Olympics in Salt Lake City both generated significant waves of branded merchandise, apparel, accessories, footwear, that moved through sporting goods stores, discount retailers, souvenir shops, and donation pipelines for years afterward. Silver and light blue. Size 7.5. Olympics on the heel. USA. The rings. These are details that someone might remember. That's the point. That is why they've been circulated for 20 years in every missing persons database, every cold case forum, every true crime community that has picked up this case and turned it over, looking for the thread that connects her to a name. No one has recognized them yet. The sweatshirt from the brand of favorites is another quiet detail. Not a designer label. Not something with immediate cultural resonance. A modest brand. The kind of clothing you find folded on the sale rack, the kind you reach for when comfort matters more than presentation. The kind of thing that says something about a life lived practically, without excess, choosing softness over statement. Was that who she was? A woman who valued comfort over appearance? Or were these simply the clothes she'd put on that morning, that particular morning, and they tell us nothing about who she was the rest of the time? We don't know. We can't know. That's the specific grief of an unidentified case. The biographical details that would make her a full person to us are gone, replaced by inventory. By a clothing description. By an estimated age range that spans 15 years because that is the margin that partial skeletal remains allowed. 30 to 45. That range contains multitudes. 30 is a person who has recently crossed a threshold, who may have children young enough to need her daily, who is in the middle of a life that is still assembling itself. 45 is someone whose life has a different shape, maybe grown children, maybe established routines, maybe a version of herself that has been in place for long enough to seem permanent. Between 30 and 45, the possibilities for who she was are nearly infinite. What narrows it, slightly, is what was done to her teeth. Several dental restorations. This is the quiet record of someone who went to a dentist at some point. Who sat in the chair, opened their mouth, let someone look inside, and had work done. This is not nothing. This requires access to dental care, financial or systemic. It requires a point in her life where she had an address, probably, and a routine that included maintenance of her own health. She was not someone who had always existed outside every system. She had been inside at least some of them, at some point. And yet no dental record match was found among the missing persons cases checked against her profile. Which means one of two things, and both of them are heavy. Either she was reported missing and the dental record comparison was not possible for some reason, records lost, dentist unreachable, the procedural gaps that exist even in systems designed to prevent them. Or she was not reported missing at all. She was not reported missing at all. Sit with that possibility. A woman between 30 and 45, with dental work indicating at least some connection to routine healthcare, wearing clothes that someone bought, in shoes that someone chose, this woman disappeared from her life and no one picked up the phone to say, she's gone. How does that happen? It happens when a life is fragile. When the connections holding a person in the world are tenuous enough that their absence can be explained, absorbed, rationalized. It happens when the people who would have called are afraid of what the calling might bring, afraid of involvement, of questions, of the attention of authorities. It happens when someone exists at the edge of a community that does not trust the systems designed to protect it. In Naples in 2004, there were communities like that. Migrant agricultural workers moving through Immokalee, the town 20 miles northeast of where she was found, living in camps and trailers and shared housing, connected to each other and disconnected from everything official. Undocumented individuals for whom any contact with law enforcement carried risks too large to calculate. Women in domestic situations where their disappearance might have been explained to neighbors, to family, to anyone who asked, by the person responsible for their disappearance. She left. She's fine. You know how she is. Those sentences again. The ones that close the door before the investigation can begin. The medical examiner could not determine a cause of death. This is not unusual in cases of advanced decomposition, but it is significant for what it forecloses. With no identifiable trauma to the bones, no fractures that definitively suggest blunt force, no marks that definitively suggest stabbing, the cause is officially undetermined. The circumstances, meaning the shallow grave, the wrapped remains, the deliberate concealment, classify her death as a suspected homicide. But legally, forensically, the cause is unknown. She may have been strangled. She may have been suffocated. She may have been poisoned. Any method that leaves no mark on bone would not be visible in what remained of her. The Florida climate, the heat, the soil, the time elapsed between her burial and her discovery, all of it erased what a medical examiner might otherwise have read in her remains. The missing bones complicate this further. The right tibia and fibula, both gone. Some of the small bones of the hands and feet, gone. The most probable explanation is animal activity, which occurs frequently in outdoor body disposals and is not particularly unusual in Florida, where the wildlife is aggressive and omnivorous. Scavengers work quickly in warm climates. They do not wait. They find what they can and they take it. But the possibility of intentional removal, of someone taking specific bones for specific reasons, is a thread that investigators would have been obligated to consider. Most experts lean heavily toward animal activity as the explanation. But most is not all. And in a case with no cause of death, no identification, and no witnesses, you do not discard the edge cases easily. Someone took the time to wrap her in a shower curtain. Someone was deliberate enough to dig a grave, even a shallow one. Someone drove out to Richards Road and made sure the ground covered her. These are not the actions of someone in total chaos. These are the actions of someone thinking, planning, managing. Would that same person have removed specific bones deliberately? It is a question without an answer. Like most of the questions in this case. The thing about Golden Gate Estates is that it has a history that runs deeper than most people realize. It was platted in the 1950s and 1960s by a developer named General Development Corporation, a company that sold inexpensive parcels of land through mail-order campaigns, through salespeople who drove potential buyers out from the coast in air-conditioned cars, through promises of Florida living that sounded like everything and turned out to be, in many cases, nothing. The land was swampy. Much of it flooded seasonally. The roads were laid out in a grid so vast and ambitious that completing the infrastructure would have taken decades and billions of dollars. Many of those roads were never finished. Many of those lots were sold to people who never built on them, who paid installments for years on a piece of land they'd never seen and would never visit. What that history left behind was an enormous tract of land, the largest platted subdivision in the United States, some say, with roads running through it in every direction, connecting parcels that were mostly empty, largely undeveloped, and profoundly private. By 2004, some sections of Golden Gate Estates had filled in. Families had built homes on the larger lots. The area closest to Naples proper had begun to look like a neighborhood. But further east, further in, the old character of the development remained. Lots sat empty. Roads ended in nowhere. The grid stretched out into the Everglades on one side and the expanding city on the other, and in the middle there were spaces, real, significant, physical spaces, where almost nothing happened and almost no one went. Richards Road was one of those spaces. Now understand what it means that a woman was buried there. It means that someone knew about that space or had found it. It means that the choice of location was not accidental. You do not arrive at Richards Road in Golden Gate Estates by mistake. You either know the area well enough to go there deliberately, or you've spent time studying a map and looking for somewhere that won't ask questions. The Collier County Sheriff's Office was the lead agency on this investigation. They are a professional department, well-resourced by the standards of Florida law enforcement, experienced with the particular challenges of a county that spans urban coast and rural interior. They processed the scene methodically. They submitted the case to every relevant database. They compared records. They worked the case. And they hit walls. The walls were not unusual in themselves. Walls are common in cases involving unidentified individuals. The identification is the linchpin on which everything else turns. Without knowing who she was, you cannot trace her movements, cannot identify her contacts, cannot determine who had access to her and reason to harm her. The identification is everything. And the identification was not coming. In the years that followed 2004, the case was not forgotten. It was simply suspended in the particular limbo of open cases that have no new leads. It sat in files. It existed in databases. It was the subject of periodic check-ins by investigators who had other cases demanding their attention, other files that were moving rather than standing still. But she did not go away. That is important to understand. She did not disappear from the record the way she had disappeared from her life. The case number remained active. The entry in NamUs continued to be maintained. The dental records, the clothing description, the forensic sketch, a careful artist's rendering of what she might have looked like, based on her skull, all of it was preserved and available. The forensic sketch is worth spending a moment on. In cases where no photograph of the victim exists, where she has not been identified and therefore no image from life can be used, forensic artists work from the skull itself. They study the measurements, the shape, the architecture of the bone, and from it they construct a face. Not her face, not exactly. A face that could have been hers. A probable face. A face designed not to be beautiful or memorable but to be accurate enough that someone who knew her might recognize the shape of her, the angle of her jaw, the placement of her eyes. Someone who knew her. That is who the sketch is for. Not for the general public to look at and admire the artistry. For someone specific, someone who knew this woman, who can look at a drawing and feel that particular catch in the chest that happens when something familiar appears in an unexpected place. The sketch circulated. It appeared in missing persons awareness communities, in cold case discussions online, in the databases that list cases like hers alongside hundreds of others, each one with a number and a description and a date and a blank space where the name should be. No one claimed her. The online cold case community eventually found her, as they find most cases like this. Reddit threads appeared. Amateur researchers built timelines, created maps, theorized about the missing bones and the Olympic shoes and the shower curtain and the meaning of the brand name favorites. People who had never been to Florida, who would never drive past Richards Road, who had no personal connection to Naples or Golden Gate Estates or April 14, 2004, these people cared about her. They spent hours of their own time trying to find the thread that hadn't been pulled yet. This is one of the stranger aspects of the modern cold case landscape. The internet has created communities of people who are genuinely invested in solving cases that official investigations have stalled on, not for credit, not for money, but because they cannot tolerate the injustice of the blank space where a name should be. They find details that were missed. They make connections that didn't exist in 2004 before every piece of Olympic merchandise was cataloged online. They reach people, potential witnesses, distant relatives, people who might have a piece of the puzzle, who would never have been reached by a local investigation with finite resources. Have they found her? Not yet. The case remains open. The NamUs profile for Collier County Jane Doe 2004 still lists her as unidentified. But the effort has never stopped, and in the era of forensic genetic genealogy, the landscape is changing in ways that felt like science fiction in 2004. Forensic genetic genealogy. The technique that has quietly revolutionized cold case identification over the past decade. It works like this: a DNA sample is taken from the unknown individual's remains. The DNA is processed by a laboratory equipped to extract and analyze genetic material even from degraded samples, samples that have been compromised by time and heat and soil chemistry, the conditions that define buried remains in Florida. A genetic profile is generated. That profile is uploaded to one of the public genealogy databases, GEDmatch, Family Tree DNA, where it can be compared against the profiles of millions of people who have submitted their own DNA for ancestry testing. The comparison doesn't produce an immediate name. What it produces is a network of partial matches, distant relatives, third cousins, fourth cousins, people who share small but measurable percentages of DNA with the unknown individual. A skilled genealogist then works these partial matches, building family trees outward from each one, looking for the intersection point, the person who fits into all of them, whose life geography and age and circumstances place them in the right area at the right time. It takes months. It takes expertise. It takes a DNA sample sufficient to work with. That last point is the obstacle. Florida is not kind to biological evidence. The heat, the humidity, the acidic soil of the Everglades region, these conditions accelerate degradation. DNA preserved in bone can sometimes survive decades even in difficult conditions, but sometimes it cannot. Whether this woman's remains have yielded a workable DNA profile for genealogical analysis is not publicly confirmed. The investigation, to the extent that it is ongoing, is conducted without a running commentary for public consumption. But here is what we know: forensic genealogy has identified people buried for decades. It has named individuals whose skeletal remains offered far less than hers. It has made the impossible routine in ways that would have seemed inconceivable even 15 years ago. The tool exists. The databases exist. The genealogists exist. The funding programs exist, including NamUs grants specifically designed for cases like hers. If the DNA is there, there is a path. If. In the meantime, she is still defined by her clothing. By a green shower curtain. By a field in Golden Gate Estates. By a deputy who stepped off the road for better phone reception on a spring morning and changed the course of what little we know about her. This is the part of the story where it is tempting to reach for meaning. To say that his accidental discovery was somehow destined, that the universe conspired to bring her to light in the only way available. And maybe that is a comfort worth taking. But the harder truth is this: she might never have been found. The field was remote enough, the burial sufficient enough, the isolation profound enough that without a random act of ordinary life, she could still be there. Unknown and unremarked. Dissolved further into the soil each year, the bones scattering a little more with each season. Eventually unrecoverable. She was found because a phone had bad reception. Think about all the things that had to line up for that to happen. The deputy's specific shift. The specific call he was trying to make. The specific 6 steps he took off the road. The specific disturbance in the earth that caught his eye rather than blurring past him the way ordinary things in familiar places tend to do. Any one of those variables shifting slightly and the field stays quiet. The curtain stays buried. She remains nothing but absence in someone's life, explained away or simply absorbed into the void. She almost wasn't found. And if she almost wasn't found, then how many others were not? That is not a rhetorical flourish. It is a real question. Florida's rural expanses have yielded remains in remote locations across decades of investigation. The state has an uncomfortable history of undiscovered burials, of remains found years or decades after placement, of people who vanished from their lives without anyone being able to explain it until a landscaping crew broke ground for a new development, or a hiker went off trail, or a deputy needed better phone reception. She is one person in this story. She is also a shadow of the broader pattern. The pattern of how women disappear. The pattern of who gets reported and who doesn't. The pattern of which communities have the resources and the safety to call law enforcement and which ones absorb loss in silence because silence feels safer. Golden Gate Estates in 2004 was a place where silence was easy. Where the space between people was literal and large. Where a grave could be dug and covered and left, and the next person to walk past might be a deputy 6 months later, chasing a cell signal. She is in that grave. And somewhere in America, maybe in Florida, maybe somewhere far from Richards Road, someone knows who she is. That person has lived with this knowledge for 20 years. 20 years is a long time to keep a secret. It is long enough for the landscape to change, for the trees near Richards Road to grow taller, for the development in Golden Gate Estates to push further east, for the Naples that existed in 2004 to become something recognizably different. Businesses closed. Buildings went up. The seasonal population swelled and contracted and swelled again. The people who lived on those quiet roads in 2004 have moved, aged, some of them died. The geography of knowing is always shifting. And still, she has no name. There is a particular quality to 20-year-old grief that is different from new grief. New grief is loud, chaotic, disorienting. It comes in waves that knock you off your feet. 20-year grief is different. It settles. It becomes part of the architecture of a person's daily life, integrated into the routine the way an old scar becomes integrated into the skin. You stop noticing it constantly. But it's always there. And certain things bring it back, a song, a smell, a certain quality of light in April, a pair of sneakers glimpsed at the bottom of a closet you haven't opened in years. If someone is missing her, 20-year grief is what they carry. If someone knows what happened to her, 20-year complicity is what they carry. And those two things are different in texture but perhaps similar in weight. The knowledge that sits undisclosed for 2 decades does not lighten with time. It calcifies. It becomes part of the self in ways that are difficult to undo. Some people live with that kind of knowledge until they die with it. Some people crack. Some people circle closer and closer to disclosure without ever arriving, confessing to themselves in the language of nightmares and avoidance and the specific anxiety that comes from keeping a secret that demands to be told. 20 years. Think about who she might have been in the ordinary sense. A woman between 30 and 45 in 2004. If she were 30 then, she would be 50 today. If she were 45, she would be 65. Her life, had it continued, would have moved through the years in the way that lives do, accumulating experiences, changing, responding to the world. She would have lived through every major event of the past 2 decades. The years of upheaval, of crisis, of technology that transformed everything. She might have had children who are now adults. She might have had grandchildren. She might have retired or changed careers or moved to a different part of the country or stayed exactly where she was, in whatever place was home before the field on Richards Road. We don't know where home was. We don't know if she had children. We don't know if she had anyone. What we know is that she had shoes. And that someone who chose them for her, or watched her pull them on, or sold them to her across a counter, is still in the world somewhere. Maybe. At the edge of every unidentified case there is that question, is anyone who knew her still alive to recognize her? Time moves. People age. The population of people who could identify her shrinks with every year that passes. At some point, and cold case investigators know this, carry it like a deadline in the back of their awareness, the window closes. Not for the DNA. The DNA, if it is recoverable, does not expire in the same way. A genealogical match can come from a distant cousin who has never met her, who doesn't know she existed, who simply submitted their DNA to learn about their ancestry and inadvertently provided the thread that pulls her back from the anonymous dark. That possibility remains open for as long as the databases exist and the samples hold. But the witness window is closing. The person who might remember seeing her car on Richards Road. The person who remembers someone mentioning a woman who vanished from their neighborhood around that time. The person who remembers a green shower curtain disappearing from a bathroom. The person who remembers something, anything, that at the time seemed unimportant, seemed like nothing, filed away and forgotten in the way that most ordinary days are filed away and forgotten. Every year, there are fewer of those people. Every year, the memories soften a little more at the edges. The Collier County Sheriff's Office has not closed this case. Cold cases in America technically remain open indefinitely. The statute of limitations on murder does not expire. The case is listed as an active investigation in the sense that it has not been formally resolved. But the resources available to an active open investigation with no new leads are limited. The detectives originally assigned to the case have long since retired or moved to other positions. The case has been handed to others, reviewed periodically, maintained in the files. The file exists. The evidence, the shower curtain, the shoes, the careful documentation of everything found at the scene, is preserved. Florida law enforcement is required to maintain evidence in homicide cases. It sits in a storage facility somewhere in Collier County, cataloged and sealed, available to future investigators or forensic labs that might approach it with new techniques. The shoes, especially, carry weight in a storage room. Silver and light blue. Size 7.5. Olympics on the heel. They are physical, specific, particular. They came from somewhere. They were sold somewhere. They were purchased by someone. Every commercial object has a supply chain, a distribution record, a moment where it moved from manufacturer to retailer to customer. Shoes with Olympic branding were produced in connection with specific games and distributed through specific channels. In 2024, the research tools available to trace that distribution are far more sophisticated than what existed in 2004. Online archival records, retired retail catalogs, collector communities who track Olympic merchandise with passionate specificity, these are resources that a cold case investigator today could deploy in ways that weren't available to the original team. A pair of silver and light blue sneakers with Olympic branding might be traceable to a specific product line, a specific year, a specific retail partnership. Which year's Olympics? That matters. The Sydney 2000 Games generated merchandise that circulated through American retail in the early 2000s. So did the 2002 Salt Lake City Games. If the shoes can be definitively linked to one event rather than the other, the timeline of her possession of them narrows. If they were 2002 Olympic merchandise, they would have been relatively new in April 2004. If they were 2000 merchandise, they'd been in circulation longer, passed through more hands. This is the kind of granular detail that cold case researchers spend their evenings on. The intersection of consumer history and forensic investigation. It sounds dry until you understand that a shoe is not just a shoe, it is a datable object, a traceable object, an object that could, theoretically, connect her to a purchase or a gift or a donation or a moment in her life that leaves a record somewhere. The internet did not exist in the same form in 2004 that it does now. The research tools available for tracing commercial objects have expanded enormously. What was a dead end in 2004 is not necessarily a dead end in 2025. And the community of people paying attention to her case has expanded, too. The true crime community, a phrase that covers an enormous range of engagement, from the deeply serious to the sensational, has a complicated relationship with unidentified cases. At its worst, it can reduce real people to puzzle pieces, their deaths a game for armchair detectives who move on when the next case captures their attention. At its best, and there is a genuine best, it creates sustained, passionate attention to cases that would otherwise exist only in databases too technical and inaccessible for most people to navigate. For her, the attention has been consistent. The Collier County Jane Doe 2004 case appears regularly in cold case forums. The details are discussed with care. The theories are weighed. The shoe description is posted alongside images of similar merchandise, asking, does anyone recognize this? The forensic sketch is shared with the question, does this face look familiar to you? No hit yet. No moment of recognition that has held up to verification. But each time it circulates, it reaches someone new. Each time it appears in a forum or a video or a podcast, it enters the field of awareness of someone who was not aware before. Someone, somewhere, is connected to her. This is not speculation about the supernatural. It is basic mathematics. A woman between 30 and 45 had a life before April 2004. She had relationships, family, friends, neighbors, colleagues, the person she bought coffee from, the person at the laundromat who knew her face. Those relationships ripple outward in networks. A family has extended members who have extended members. A neighborhood reaches into other neighborhoods. A workplace connects people who then go on to connect with others. The network of human connection that surrounded her life, as small or as large as it was, continues to exist in some form today, degraded by time and distance but not eliminated. Somewhere in that network, someone is carrying knowledge they may not know is knowledge. What does that mean? It means that cold cases are sometimes cracked not by the person with direct information, the witness, the participant, the accomplice, but by someone who had a small piece of information they didn't know was a piece. Someone who saw a name written somewhere and didn't think much of it at the time. Someone who heard a story secondhand and dismissed it. Someone who is sitting in their living room right now, watching a video about a woman buried in a green shower curtain in a field in Naples, Florida, and feeling something stir in their memory that they can't quite place. That feeling. That specific stirring. That is what these stories are for. Not the procedural satisfaction of a case resolved. Not the neat ending where the guilty party is named and the victim is given back her identity and the credits roll. It is for the person sitting somewhere in the world who might, in the act of watching, remember something they forgot they knew. If you are that person, if you are watching this and something is moving in the back of your mind, something you can't quite name but can feel, the number to call is the Collier County Sheriff's Office. The NamUs case for Collier County Jane Doe 2004 is publicly accessible. The case is open. There is no statute of limitations on what you know. Let's talk about what it means to bury someone in a shower curtain. Not in the clinical sense. Not in the procedural sense. In the human sense. In the sense of what that act reveals about the person who performed it, the state of mind, the circumstances, the relationship between the living and the dead in that specific, awful moment on Richards Road. A shower curtain is not a body bag. It is not a professional container designed for the purpose of transporting remains. It is the furthest thing from that. It is domestic. It belongs to the rhythm of daily life in the most intimate way, the morning shower, the steam, the smell of soap, the moment of private transition between sleep and the world. It is background. It is barely seen. And yet someone saw it, in a moment of crisis or calculation, and reached for it. This tells us something. It tells us that this person was not prepared in the professional sense. They didn't have the equipment that a person who plans murders in advance tends to acquire. They had a shower curtain because a shower curtain was there. Because wherever this happened, wherever she died, wherever the decision was made to move her, there was a bathroom, and in the bathroom there was a curtain, and in the terrible arithmetic of the moment, that curtain became the tool. This is what investigators call evidence of opportunity. Not the crime itself, necessarily, but the method of concealment, improvised, domestic, personal. It connects the crime to a space. A home. A private space with a shower. And it connects the perpetrator to that space. They knew where the curtain was, they could reach it, they had the physical access to remove it and use it. There is almost always a relationship between a victim and a perpetrator in cases of this kind. The stranger murder, the completely random predation, is statistically rarer than popular culture suggests. Most violence against women comes from people they know. People they have allowed into their private spaces. People who have been in that bathroom, who knew about the shower curtain, who had been in that domestic interior often enough to think of it first when they needed something large and opaque and immediately available. This is not certain. It is a pattern, not a law. Stranger violence occurs. Opportunity crimes occur. But the behavioral profile suggested by the shower curtain, the domesticity of it, the intimacy of it, leans toward someone who had been inside her life in some regular and close way. An intimate partner. A roommate. A family member. Someone who knew the geography of her home the way you know the geography of a place you've spent real time in. The wrapping of the body also suggests something about the state of mind. Wrapping takes time. It requires the presence of mind to do it, to unfold the curtain, to position the remains, to fold the edges, to create a package sufficient for transport. This is not consistent with someone in blind panic. Someone in blind panic runs. Someone in blind panic leaves. The wrapping, imperfect, maybe, but functional, suggests a person who had moved past the initial shock of what had happened and into a mode of management. Problem solving in the bleakest possible sense. How much time passed between her death and her burial? We don't know. The condition of the remains at discovery could not precisely answer this. But someone had to make the decision, execute it, transport her, dig, bury, cover, and leave without being detected. This is not a quick process. This required sustained focus over a period of time, hours, possibly. And whoever did this maintained that focus long enough to complete it. That is a significant thing. That is not nothing. That requires a certain quality of internal resource that not everyone has in a crisis. It suggests someone who was capable of compartmentalizing, of setting aside the magnitude of what they had done long enough to manage the logistics of what needed to happen next. This is a clinical observation, not an admiring one. But it matters for understanding who this person might be, or might have been. The location selection fits this profile. A person capable of sustained focus under pressure is also capable of identifying a location in advance, or rapidly, in the moment of crisis, identifying a location from memory. Richards Road is not on the way to anything in particular. It requires a choice. It requires someone to think, where can I go? And to answer that question with enough specificity to arrive at a place that worked. 20 years. Has this person's capacity for that kind of management persisted? Have they built a life on top of what they did? People do. Investigators know this. The same cognitive architecture that allows a person to manage a crisis, to keep a secret, to maintain a normal exterior, to continue functioning in the world as though nothing has happened, also allows a person to survive and function and sometimes even thrive in the decades after a crime. Some killers go on to have families. To go to church. To become known as kind neighbors, good colleagues, generous friends. The compartmentalization that served them in the moment of crisis serves them in the long game of concealment. Life closes over the event like skin closing over a wound. The scar is there, inside, but the surface looks smooth. Is there someone in Florida, or somewhere else in America, whose life looks smooth from the outside and holds this underneath? Almost certainly yes. The mathematics of unsolved cases suggest it. More than 30% of homicides in the United States go unsolved. In cases with unidentified victims, the number is higher, because without identification, the investigation has no starting point. Without a name for her, investigators cannot build a suspect profile. Without a suspect profile, there are no interviews, no confrontations, no moments where someone's story doesn't quite hold together under questioning. The identification is the beginning of everything, and without it, the investigation has nowhere to go. And so, for 20 years, the person who did this has had the benefit of her anonymity. Her invisibility protects them. The fact that she has no name in the system means that no one has come to their door with questions specifically about her. They are invisible too, in this sense, shielded by her silence. There is something profoundly unjust about this. It is the secondary injury of an unidentified case. First, she lost her life. Second, her anonymity, her erasure from the record, becomes a protective condition for whoever is responsible. The two erasures are connected. She is unnamed, and therefore whoever unnamed her is also unreachable. But this has changed in 2 decades. Forensic genealogy does not require her identity to be known in advance. It works backward from the DNA. It asks not who is she, but who is connected to her genetically, and builds outward from there. A third cousin she never met, living in another state, who submitted a swab to learn about their ancestry, this person could be the key that unlocks her identity without anyone knowing they held it. The databases are growing every year. Millions of people have submitted DNA for genealogical analysis. The probability that at least one of her biological relatives is in one of those databases is high and increasing. The probability that enough close relatives have submitted samples to allow a full genealogical reconstruction is growing too, as the practice of consumer DNA testing becomes more widespread. She may not remain unnamed much longer. That is not a promise. It is an observation grounded in the trajectory of forensic science and the expanding scale of genealogical databases. Cases older and colder than hers have been cracked. Women buried longer, with less preserved, in worse conditions, have been brought back to their names through the patient work of genealogists and the growing library of genetic profiles. The DNA has to be there. That's the condition. And we don't know if it is. But we know that people are still trying. The case is still listed. The evidence is still preserved. The forensic community that has developed new tools for exactly these circumstances is still growing, still improving, still reaching backward into cold case files with technology that didn't exist when those cases went cold. She is not forgotten. That is real. Whatever else is uncertain, whatever we don't know about who she was or who did this or why she has gone unnamed for 20 years, the fact that she is not forgotten is real. There are people who have never met her who know the details of her shoes. Who could sketch the general area where she was found. Who have spent hours of their own evenings researching her case because the blank space where her name should be is intolerable to them in some fundamental way that they might struggle to articulate. This is not nothing. This is something. This is the part of the story where the weight shifts slightly, not toward resolution, not toward comfort, but toward the acknowledgement that she matters. That she has been made to matter by people who owe her nothing except their humanity. And she deserves to matter. 30 to 45, in a gray sweatshirt, in silver and light blue shoes, in a green shower curtain in a shallow grave on a road most people have never heard of, she deserves to have her name given back. Imagine you are sitting in a car at the edge of a dirt road in rural Florida. It is 2004. The engine is off. Outside the window, the grass is tall and still in the early morning, the kind of stillness that comes before the heat of the day breaks through. There is no one else on the road. There is no other car, no other light, nothing human visible in any direction. You are doing something. You don't want to think about what you are doing. You have trained your mind, in the hours since this began, to focus on the logistics and not the meaning. The meaning is too large. The meaning would undo you. So you focus on the task, on making sure the earth is covered, on making sure there is nothing left behind that marks this place as different from the rest of the field, on the specific physical actions that need to happen in a specific sequence. And when it is done, you walk back to the car. You start the engine. You pull back onto the road. The road looks the same as it did when you arrived. The sky is beginning to lighten slightly at the edge. You drive. You leave the area. You drive past roads with names and roads without, past the occasional house with its lights still off, past the part of Golden Gate Estates where development is beginning to fill in and the part where it isn't. You drive until you reach something familiar. A gas station. A convenience store. A landmark that belongs to ordinary life. And then what? Then ordinary life resumes. This is the part that is hardest to comprehend from the outside. The resumption of ordinary life. The moment where the extraordinary terrible thing that has just happened gets sealed behind a door in the mind and the world continues its normal presentation. Traffic. The morning news. The smell of coffee. The particular sound of a phone ringing in an empty room. These things continue. The person who drove back from Richards Road that morning, or whatever morning it was, continued to experience them. Continued to move through the world in the shape of a person to whom nothing unusual had happened. Continued to have conversations, to eat meals, to sleep when sleep came, to wake when the day required it. This is how people survive the things they do. Not by processing them. By compartmentalizing them. By building a wall between the thing that happened and the life that has to continue. The wall is not metaphorical, it is neurological. It is a feature of the human mind that can be used for survival and for harm in equal measure. Soldiers use it to function in combat. Survivors of trauma use it to get through the day. And people who have done terrible things use it to keep living as though they haven't. The wall holds. Usually. For a while. For some people, for decades. But the wall has cracks. They are visible, if you know how to look. The anniversary of the date tends to produce them, some shift in mood or behavior that the people closest to this person might have noticed and not understood. Certain triggers. Certain news stories. A case like hers appearing on television, circulated in the true crime community, picked up by someone's social media algorithm and delivered to a screen in the room where this person is sitting. What does that feel like? To see your secret circulating in the world. To see the details, the shower curtain, the shoes, the estimated age, the location, laid out for public consideration. To know that somewhere in the discussion, someone is theorizing about who could have done this, what kind of person they might be, whether they still live in the area. Does it feel like danger? Like exposure? Or has it been long enough that it feels almost abstract, like something that happened to someone else, in another life, in a version of the story that has been so deeply buried it barely feels real anymore? 20 years of compartmentalization will do that. 20 years of sealing the door will make the room behind it feel like someone else's memory. The mind is adaptive in ways that are both remarkable and terrifying. It can learn to live with almost anything if it has to. Meanwhile, the case has continued its quiet circulation. The NamUs profile for the 2004 Collier County Jane Doe has been accessed hundreds of times. The fandom wiki page that details her case has been viewed by thousands of people across the world. Forum threads have been started and continued across years, with new users arriving to contribute theories and observations alongside veterans of the discussion who have been following the case for a decade. Someone in one of those threads noted, years ago, that the Olympic sneakers might indicate a connection to a specific period of merchandise distribution. The 2002 Winter Olympics in Salt Lake City generated significant amounts of USA-branded athletic merchandise in silver and blue, colors associated with the American Olympic team's aesthetic for those games. Silver and light blue. If those shoes were Salt Lake City 2002 merchandise, they would have been only 2 years old when they were buried with her. They would have been relatively new. Someone might have bought them recently, or received them as a gift, or picked them up at a discount retailer where Olympic merchandise went after the games ended. This is the level of granularity that cold case research reaches. It is painstaking and slow and often circles back on itself. But it is not purposeless. Every detail traced, every possibility narrowed, every piece of the story brought into slightly sharper focus is one step closer to the name. The dental restorations she had are another avenue that has been explored without yet yielding a result. Dental work in the early 2000s often involved materials and techniques that can be identified as characteristic of specific periods or regions. A forensic odontologist, a dentist trained in the analysis of dental evidence, can sometimes determine whether work was done in the United States or elsewhere, whether it reflects the standards of American dentistry or the materials and methods of another country. This is not foolproof, but it can narrow the field. If her dental work was American, she likely had access to the American dental system at some point. She likely had insurance, or a clinic that served her without it. She likely had some form of stable connection to a community, long enough to establish care, long enough to have multiple restorations over time. If her dental work reflected another country's materials or methods, then the possibility of her being an immigrant, documented or undocumented, becomes more significant. The Collier County area in 2004 had a substantial population of people who had immigrated from Mexico, Guatemala, Honduras, and other Latin American countries to work in agriculture and construction. Many of them existed in the informal economy, and banked, without formal records, connected to their home communities by phone calls and remittances and seasonal patterns of migration. If she was among them, her disappearance might have been absorbed into that particular silence, not because no one cared, but because reporting it carried risks that the people who cared could not afford. This is the hardest version of her story to sit with. The one where her absence has been mourned privately, in a community that couldn't come forward. Where people who loved her have spent 20 years not knowing what happened, believing perhaps that she moved on, that the silence was her choice, that somewhere she was living a life they couldn't reach. Or knowing the truth privately, in their bones, but unable to say it. That version of the story is not the only one. But it is possible. And it deserves to be held with the seriousness it warrants. In recent years, the investigation of cold cases involving undocumented individuals has become somewhat more sensitive to the communities it touches. Outreach efforts in multiple languages, assurances around the separation of immigration enforcement from criminal investigation, partnerships with advocacy organizations that have the trust of immigrant communities, these efforts exist and have produced results in cases where they might previously have been foreclosed by fear. Whether this case has been worked through those channels specifically, and what those efforts have produced, is not publicly documented. What is public is the NamUs entry and the ongoing classification as unidentified. She is still waiting. The field is still there. The road is still there. The deputy who found her has long since moved on to other chapters of his career and his life. The trees have grown around the edges of the area where she was found. The development has continued to encroach from the west, slowly, with the particular relentlessness of Florida suburban expansion. But she is still there, in the files. In the databases. In the cold case forums where people who care about justice and human dignity spend their evenings trying to find the thread. And somewhere, a person who bought a pair of silver and light blue sneakers, or received them as a gift, or sold them, or donated them, or passed them along in some ordinary transaction that they have probably forgotten entirely, holds a piece of the puzzle without knowing it. Memory is strange. It keeps things we don't know it's keeping. It surfaces things at unexpected moments, not in response to direct questioning, but in the sideways way that memory works, triggered by smell or sound or the particular slant of light on a Tuesday morning that matches the light on some other Tuesday morning 20 years ago. Someone will remember something. Or a DNA match will surface in a genealogy database. Or a forensic genealogist will trace the right branch of the right family tree and arrive at a name that fits the profile. Or a photograph will circulate to the right person at the right time, and the face in the forensic sketch will align with the face in someone's memory in a way that can't be dismissed. One of these things will happen. The question is when. There is a concept in psychology called the bystander effect. The more people present in a situation, the less likely any individual is to act. The responsibility diffuses across the crowd until no one in particular feels compelled to step forward, because surely someone else will. Surely someone else has already handled it. Surely the burden does not specifically fall on me. Cold cases live in a version of this effect. When a case is widely circulated, when it exists in databases, in forums, in true crime communities where thousands of people are aware of it, there is a paradox at work. The wide circulation that brings it to more potential witnesses and more potential sources of recognition is also the thing that creates the sense that surely someone else already knows what needs to be known. Surely someone has made the call. Surely if there was an answer, it would have come by now. But sometimes it comes late. Sometimes it comes from someone who assumed the case was already resolved. Sometimes it comes from someone who didn't know there was a case at all. Someone whose personal connection to the victim was private enough, quiet enough, that they didn't realize the woman they were thinking about was the same woman in the file. This is the nature of the work. Casting wide enough that it catches what the previous cast missed. For 20 years, April 14th passes. The date is just a date for most people, the kind of ordinary spring day that means nothing in particular, that blends into the calendar without leaving a mark. But in the case file, it is fixed. It is the day a deputy walked into a field. It is the day the story of her discovered absence began. For the people tracking this case, April 14th is a kind of quiet marker, an annual reminder that another year has passed and the name remains blank. There are other markers in the case, too. The anniversaries that no one outside the file knows to observe. Whatever day she died. Whatever day she was moved. Whatever day someone made the decision that a field in Golden Gate Estates was where she would end up. Those days pass too, unremarked in the public record, felt only by whoever holds the private knowledge. The psychological literature on people who live with undisclosed guilt over long periods of time describes something researchers have called a moral injury, a sustained wound to the self-concept that comes from acting in a way that violates one's own internalized ethical framework. Not everyone who commits violence has such a framework. But many people do, and for those people, the injury is real and the management of it is costly. It shows up in health outcomes. In relationship patterns. In the particular way some people hold themselves when certain subjects arise. In nightmares. In avoidance. This is not a theory about the specific person who did this. It is an observation about what the research tells us. Not everyone who carries a secret like this one is visibly damaged by it. Some people are genuinely able to wall it off. But most people are not. Most people, in some part of their lives, are shaped by it. Made smaller by it, or harder by it, or more careful by it in ways that people who are close to them have always felt without being able to name. The cost of secrecy is always paid by someone. Sometimes it is paid by the person keeping the secret. Sometimes it ripples outward, into the relationships that have been made impossible by what cannot be said, the intimacy that cannot be achieved because the other person can never fully know you, the life that is always slightly smaller than it could be because part of your story is permanently sealed. 20 years of that. It is worth spending a moment on the community that was most directly surrounding this case in 2004. Naples, Florida had a population of roughly 20,000 in the city proper, with the greater metropolitan area, including communities like Immokalee, Marco Island, and the unincorporated areas of Collier County, adding tens of thousands more. It was a place of significant socioeconomic disparity. The gulf between the waterfront estates of Old Naples and the farm worker camps of Immokalee was profound, not just in wealth but in visibility, in institutional attention, in whose problems got solved and whose got absorbed. The Immokalee community deserves specific mention here, not because there is any evidence connecting the victim to it, but because it is relevant context for understanding the invisible populations of Collier County in 2004. Immokalee sits roughly 20 miles northeast of where she was found. It was, and remains, a community with a large migrant agricultural workforce, largely from Mexico and Central America, largely living in difficult conditions, largely outside the formal systems of documentation and institutional support. Women in this community were vulnerable in specific, documented ways. Exploitation by employers and landlords was common. Access to services was limited. Trust in law enforcement was low, for good historical reasons. If she was from this community, or from a similar community anywhere in South Florida, the explanation for her anonymous death is not mysterious. It is the predictable consequence of a system that was not designed to protect her. Not maliciously, perhaps, but through the accumulated effects of institutions that functioned well for some people and functioned poorly or not at all for others. This is the political truth underneath the personal tragedy. It is uncomfortable. It is true. At the same time, she may not have been from this community at all. She may have been a local resident who was well-connected and well-documented and is simply missing from the records due to procedural failure rather than systemic invisibility. She may have been a tourist or a seasonal visitor. She may have been from another state entirely, her absence registered in a missing persons file somewhere that was never successfully cross-referenced with her case in Florida. The geographic reach of the investigation is not fully known from public records. Whether investigators circulated her information across state lines in 2004, and to what extent, and what responses they received, is not documented in detail in the public record. What we know is the result, 20 years, and she is still unnamed. The forensic sketch produced in this case is a face that belongs to a set of measurements, a set of proportions derived from bone. It is not a photograph. It is not a memory. It is a construction, careful, professional, informed by forensic science, but it is also inevitably approximate. The question it asks of any viewer is not, is this her, exactly? It is, does this face remind you of someone? It is asking the viewer to do the work of closing the gap between the reconstruction and the memory of a real face. That gap is where identifications happen. In the space between the forensic rendering and the moment of recognition, when a viewer looks at a drawing and something clicks, not certainty, not proof, but the feeling of familiarity that can become a phone call that becomes a record request that becomes a dental comparison that becomes a name. That moment has not come for this case. But the drawing continues to circulate. The NamUs profile continues to be updated as new technologies and new processes become available. The case continues to be the subject of interest from people who believe, with some basis in the history of forensic genealogy, that it can be solved. Let's talk about what solving it would actually mean. Not in the legal sense, the criminal investigation, the potential prosecution, the judicial outcomes that might or might not follow an identification. In the human sense. What does it mean to give her name back? It means that somewhere, someone stops not knowing. It means that a family, if there is a family, if there is anyone still living who was connected to her, gets the answer to a question they have either been asking for 20 years or have stopped asking because asking became too painful. It means that the woman in the file stops being a clothing description and a case number and becomes a person with a history and a childhood and a face that someone actually knew. It means that the grave on Richards Road, anonymous for so long, becomes specific. Mournable in the way that named graves are mournable. The difference between a grave with a name and a grave without one is not small. It is the difference between a place you can go and a place that has no address in grief. It means that the investigation can move forward. Because with a name comes a history, and with a history come possible suspects, and with possible suspects comes the possibility, not the certainty, but the real possibility, of justice. Not closure. The word closure is almost never accurate in cases like this. But justice. The legal acknowledgement of what happened. The naming of responsibility. For her, that possibility is still open. 20 years later, it is still open. The case has not been closed. The evidence has not been destroyed. The science has not stopped moving forward. She is still reachable. If you are watching this and something is sitting with you, something you saw, something you heard, something someone said years ago that didn't mean anything at the time, the Collier County Sheriff's Office is the right phone call. The NamUs case can be searched by anyone with internet access. You do not need to be certain. You do not need to have proof. You need only to have a piece, and to offer it, and let the people who hold the rest of the file determine whether your piece fits. If you have never thought about this case before tonight, you are thinking about it now. That matters. Every additional person who carries awareness of this case is one more variable in the equation. One more possible path to the thread that hasn't been pulled yet. She wore silver and light blue shoes. Someone chose those shoes. Someone is still in the world who saw her in them. The field on Richards Road is quiet now. It has always been quiet. That is the thing about places where terrible things have happened, they do not retain the energy of those things in any visible way. They just continue. The grass grows. The seasons cycle through. The light changes across the sky the way it has always changed, oblivious to what the earth beneath it holds. She was found there on April 14, 2004, and she has been in the record ever since, in the files of the Collier County Sheriff's Office, in the databases of the FBI and NamUs, in the pages of the Unidentified wiki maintained by people who track these cases with the devotion of archivists. In all of those places, she is real. She exists. She has physical characteristics and estimated age ranges and clothing descriptions and a forensic sketch that tries, as honestly as it can, to suggest what her face looked like. But in the living world, in the world of people who knew her, who called her by name, who would recognize the sound of her laugh or the specific way she moved through a doorway, she is absent. Has been absent for over 2 decades. Whatever shape her absence has taken in the lives of the people who were connected to her, that shape has been present for a very long time. If there are people who love her. This is the phrase that has to be qualified, and qualifying it is its own particular grief. In most cases of violent death, the assumption that someone is waiting, someone is searching, someone is devastated by the loss, that assumption is correct. And in this case, it may well be correct. There may be people who have spent 20 years not knowing what happened to her, who have lived with that not knowing the way you live with a wound that never fully heals. People who have kept her photograph somewhere private. Who have said her name in quiet moments when there was no one to hear. But 20 years without a missing persons match is a fact. 46 women ruled out is a fact. The absence of a successful identification through standard channels is a fact. And facts can have multiple explanations, but one of those explanations, the one that is hardest to look at directly, is that the people who would have called did not call. That her disappearance was absorbed rather than reported. That she moved through the world in ways that did not generate the kind of institutional documentation that makes people findable when they are lost. And if that is true, it is not her failure. It is a systemic failure. It is the failure of a world that organizes its protections unevenly and leaves some people more exposed than others, more exposed to violence, to exploitation, to the specific vulnerability that comes with existing at the edge of systems rather than inside them. She deserved better than the world that was built around her. This is the truth at the center of every unidentified case. Not just the crime. Not just the perpetrator. The entire constellation of circumstances that led to someone being buried in a field and remaining unnamed for 20 years. The systems that should have caught her absence and didn't. The institutions that should have been accessible to her and weren't. The community, whatever it was, that should have had the capacity to miss her loudly enough that the world had to listen. She deserved to be missed loudly. She deserved to have her name in the database not as the unknown but as the person being searched for. She deserved the urgency that is applied to some cases and withheld from others, and she deserved it regardless of where she came from or what her circumstances were or how neatly she fit into the category of a person whose disappearance gets treated as a priority. Every unidentified case is an argument for this. Every woman in a shallow grave who takes decades to name is an argument for the expansion of the systems designed to find people before they become files. This is not the end she deserved. But here, now, in this story that 20 years of investigation have not yet resolved, here is what is possible. The possibility of a DNA match. The possibility of a forensic genealogist building the right family tree. The possibility that somewhere in the living world, a person is carrying a memory they don't know is important, and that the right video or the right article or the right moment of alignment brings that memory to the surface in a way that becomes a phone call. The possibility that next April 14th is different from the ones before it. It doesn't take much. In the history of cold case identification solved by genealogy and community attention, the catalyst has often been something that looked modest from the outside. A post shared in the right online group. A genealogy submission from a distant cousin who had no idea they were related to someone in an open case. A conversation started by someone who watched something like this and decided, for reasons they couldn't fully articulate, that they needed to make one call. That call has not been made yet. Or if it has not yet produced the match. But the case is open. The line is available. The people tracking this are still there. And she is still waiting. Think about what it means that she had dental work. That someone, at some point, sat across from her in a dental chair and looked at her mouth and saw the work that had been done and probably made the kind of small talk that happens in those rooms, something ordinary, something about the weather, about the weekend, about nothing in particular. That person saw her face. Heard her voice. Probably forgot about her the moment she walked out of the office. But the work they did on her teeth is still there in the record. The restorations she had are still visible in the forensic analysis of her remains. The bridge between her living life and her silent file runs through the dental work, through the hands of someone who saw her and treated her and sent her back into the world without knowing that the record they kept of that appointment might someday matter. Dental offices keep records for years. Decades, in many cases. The dentist who worked on her may have retired. May have passed records to another practice. May have digitized old paper files in the years since. The records exist somewhere in a chain that may still be traceable if the right identifying information could be used to search it. The identifying information requires the name. And the name requires the identification. And the identification requires the DNA or the witness or the memory or the match that has not yet come. These circles. They close in on each other and open back up again. The case lives in them. She lived in a world. That world was real and ordinary and full of the texture of daily life, the small moments that constitute a person's experience, the routine choices and accidental conversations and unnoticed details that make up the fabric of any human existence. She ate food that someone cooked or she cooked herself. She slept somewhere and woke up and had opinions about the morning. She put on those shoes, silver and light blue, Olympic branding, size 7.5, and went somewhere or did something, and none of it felt like a last anything, because she didn't know it was. No one knows their last day is their last day. That is the almost universal condition of violent death. It happens while you are living. While you are in the middle of expecting more. She was in the middle of expecting more. Somewhere between that expectation and Richard's Road, everything ended. And then it didn't, not entirely. Because the case stayed open. Because the deputy walked into the field. Because the forensic sketch was made and the databases were updated and the cold case community found her and kept finding her, returning to the details, circulating the information, asking the question that has no answer yet. Who was she? That question is still out there. Moving through the internet in threads and databases and videos like this one, moving through communities where someone might, at some unexpected moment, feel the particular jolt of recognition that changes everything. Who was she is the question. And the answer exists somewhere. In someone's memory. In a DNA database. In a dental record in a storage room. In a photograph in someone's phone or shoebox or the part of the cloud where old images go to be forgotten. The answer exists. We just haven't reached it yet. If this story reached you, if you've sat with it long enough to feel the weight of it, to let her be real to you in the way that she deserves to be real, then you are carrying something now. The awareness. The knowledge that she exists as a case number and a clothing description and a forensic sketch, and that somewhere behind those details is a full human life that has been waiting 20 years to be given back its name. Carry that. Talk about it. Share it. Drop a comment below about what you noticed, what you thought, what it made you feel, because this kind of case lives and breathes through public attention, and every person who cares is another variable in the equation. If you have information, anything, however small, however uncertain, call the Collier County Sheriff's Office. Look up the NamUs case for Collier County Jane Doe 2004. Make the call that might be the call. You don't need to be certain. You just need to be willing. And if you are here because you care about stories like this, because you believe that the unnamed deserve to be named, that the anonymous deserve to be made specific, that the cases that fall through the cracks deserve to be lifted back out, then subscribe. Stay. There are more cases like hers. More names that are waiting. More people who went into fields that nobody visited for a long time and who are still in the record, still in the files, still waiting for the thread that hasn't been pulled yet. Like this video so it reaches someone who needs to see it. Share it. Not for the numbers. For her. Because the green shower curtain is still in evidence storage in Collier County. The shoes with the Olympic branding are still documented in the file. The forensic sketch is still on the NamUs profile, next to an estimated age range and a clothing description and a case number. And she still has no name. That is the sentence that will not let go. That is the sentence that should not be comfortable. That is the sentence that should keep pulling at you long after this video ends, in the small quiet moments of your own ordinary life, while you are putting on shoes or making coffee or driving a road you know by heart. She still has no name. Until that changes, this isn't over.